Declassified. 1942. The South Pacific, where palm trees met coral atolls and the sky belonged to predators. A lone Mitsubishi A6M Zero, its Hinomaru sun emblem gleaming against polished aluminum, prowled at 15,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The pilot, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, was a veteran of China, Pearl Harbor, and the devastating sweep through Southeast Asia. He had 23 confirmed victories painted beneath his canopy. In his mind, and in the minds of every Allied pilot who had faced the Zero, this aircraft was invincible. For good reason. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies for nearly 2 years with a performance envelope that seemed to defy physics. It could outturn anything the Allies flew. It could outclimb most fighters. Its range was staggering, over 1,900 miles, allowing operations deep into enemy territory where Allied fighters couldn't follow. Japanese pilots, trained to exploit every advantage of this remarkable machine, had achieved kill ratios that approached 10-to-1 in some theaters. Allied intelligence had studied captured Zeros, dissected their strengths, and catalogued their weaknesses. But knowledge and implementation were different things. You couldn't simply tell a pilot, "Don't turn with a Zero," when every instinct screamed to engage in a dogfight. The psychological dominance of the Zero was as lethal as its 20mm cannon. But on this particular morning, something unexpected entered Nakamura's domain. A glint of reflected sunlight, 2,000 feet above him. He squinted against the tropical glare and identified the silhouette, an elliptical wing platform that didn't belong in this theater. A supermarine Spitfire. The presence of a Spitfire this far into the Pacific was highly unusual. These were European fighters, designed to defend Britain against the Luftwaffe, not to operate from primitive jungle airstrips thousands of miles from home. But a handful had been shipped to Australia and were being experimentally deployed to determine if they could compete with the Zero in conditions radically different from the skies over England. The pilot of this particular Spitfire was Flight Lieutenant Colin Fraser, a Battle of Britain veteran who had requested transfer to the Pacific Theatre after losing his brother at Singapore. He was flying a Spitfire MKVC, a tropicalized variant with reinforced landing gear for rough airstrips, a Vokes air filter to prevent engine damage from coral dust, and additional fuel capacity for the vast distances of Pacific combat. Fraser had studied every scrap of intelligence about the Zero. He knew its reputation. He also knew its vulnerabilities, things that Japanese pilots had kept carefully hidden through tactical brilliance and aggressive combat doctrine. The Zero was lightly built, trading armor and structural strength for performance. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its wings, though magnificently maneuverable at low speeds, became dangerously sluggish at high velocity, and most critically, it couldn't dive worth a damn. Nakamura spotted the Spitfire simultaneously. His first reaction was contempt. European fighters had proven no match for the Zero. The Hurricane, the Buffalo, even the vaunted American Wildcats, all had fallen before the superior agility of Japanese naval aviation. This Spitfire, impressive though it might be against German aircraft, was about to learn a hard lesson about Pacific air combat. He began his attack with textbook precision. Banking into a climbing turn, he positioned himself to force the Spitfire into a turning engagement, where the Zero's legendary maneuverability would dominate. Every encounter Nakamura had experienced followed this pattern. The enemy pilot would try to turn, the Zero would outturn them, and within seconds the victor would be decided. Fraser saw the Zero beginning its approach and did something that surprised the Japanese pilot. He didn't try to turn. Instead, he shoved the throttle forward and nosed the Spitfire into a shallow dive, converting altitude into speed. The Merlin engine, one of the finest piston engines ever built, roared with power. The Spitfire accelerated rapidly, pulling away from the Zero. Nakamura frowned. This was unexpected. He pushed his own throttle forward, but the Zero's Sakai engine, optimized for endurance and agility rather than raw power, couldn't match the acceleration of the supercharged Merlin. The Spitfire was getting away, but Nakamura was patient. He knew that eventually the British pilot would have to turn and fight. Fuel wouldn't last forever. The Spitfire would run out of sky, out of options, and then the superior agility of the Zero would prevail. He settled into pursuit, maintaining visual contact, waiting for the moment when his opponent's tactics would fail. What Nakamura didn't realize was that he was no longer the hunter. He was being lured into a trap designed by a pilot who understood both aircraft intimately and who was about to demonstrate that the invincible Zero had finally met its match. Fraser climbed, not in a steep, energy-bleeding pull, but in a steady, efficient ascent that the Spitfire's Merlin engine was perfectly suited for. The supercharger, designed for high-altitude combat over Europe, gave him a critical advantage in the thinner air above 15,000 feet. Behind him, Nakamura followed, but the Zero's climb rate, while impressive at lower altitudes, began to falter as the air grew thinner. This was the first crack in Nakamura's confidence. The Zero had always been able to dictate the terms of engagement. But this British pilot wasn't playing by the expected rules. He wasn't turning to fight. He wasn't running away in panic. He was climbing, deliberately, methodically, as if he knew something Nakamura didn't. At 20,000 feet, Fraser leveled off and executed a wing-over, a graceful maneuver that reversed his direction and brought him diving back toward the Zero from a superior position. Nakamura, anticipating this, prepared for a head-on engagement. The Zero's 20mm cannon and twin 7.7mm machine guns were devastating in a frontal attack. Many Allied pilots had died trying to play chicken with a Zero, but Fraser didn't commit to the head-on pass. At the last moment, he rolled inverted and pulled through, converting his dive into another climb on the opposite side of Nakamura. The Japanese pilot, forced to choose between following or losing visual contact, pulled hard into a turn to track his opponent. And there was the mistake. The Zero, for all its legendary agility at low speeds, became a different aircraft at high velocity. The control forces increased dramatically. The ailerons, which responded like feathers at 150 knots, became stiff and unresponsive at 300 knots. The wings, optimized for tight turning at dogfight speeds, generated dangerous levels of stress at the velocities Fraser was now forcing on the engagement. Fraser knew this because Allied intelligence had finally cracked the Zero's secrets. Air-captured aircraft in the Aleutians, studied exhaustively by American engineers, had revealed the truth. The Zero was a masterpiece at low-speed maneuvering combat, but it was dangerously vulnerable in high-speed vertical engagements. Its lightweight construction, which made it so agile, also made it fragile. Its lack of armor, which saved weight, made it lethally vulnerable to even brief bursts of gunfire. The Spitfire, by contrast, was over-engineered for European combat. It had armor plate protecting the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb hits without exploding. Its wings were stressed for high-speed maneuvers and violent combat loads. It wasn't as nimble as the Zero in a slow-speed turn, but in a high-speed vertical knife fight, it was superior in every measurable way. Fraser executed a series of yo-yo maneuvers, vertical scissors, that kept him in the energy-advantaged position above Nakamura, while preventing the Zero from bringing its superior turning ability to bear. Each time Nakamura tried to turn into Fraser's attacks, the Spitfire would zoom vertically, converting speed into altitude, then diving back down with renewed energy. Nakamura began to realize he was in trouble. His fuel gauge was dropping. The long pursuit had consumed precious gasoline. His ammunition was limited. He'd fired several bursts that had missed as the Spitfire maneuvered unpredictably. And most critically, he couldn't get a sustained firing solution. Every time he thought he had the British fighter lined up, it would be gone, dancing in the vertical plane where the Zero couldn't follow effectively. The psychological tables had turned. Nakamura, accustomed to dominating every engagement, was now on the defensive. He tried every trick he knew, snap rolls, vertical reversals, even a desperate split S that nearly blacked him out with G-forces. Nothing worked. The Spitfire stayed above him, controlled, patient, methodical. Fraser's combat experience from the Battle of Britain was proving invaluable. He had fought Messerschmitt Bf-109s, arguably the finest fighter aircraft Germany produced, and had learned that superior technology meant nothing without superior tactics. The Bf-109 had been faster than early Spitfires, could dive better, and had fuel injection that prevented engine cutouts in negative G maneuvers. But British pilots had learned to exploit the Spitfire's superior turning ability and sustained climbing performance to defeat them. Now facing the Zero, Fraser was applying those same principles in reverse. Don't fight the enemy's strengths. Fight your own strengths. The Zero could outturn him? Fine. Don't turn. The Zero was lighter and more agile at low speeds. Perfect. Keep the fight fast and vertical. The Zero had longer range, irrelevant if the engagement was decided quickly. At 18,000 feet, Fraser saw his opening. Nakamura, frustrated and low on options, committed to a climbing turn, trying one last time to bring his superior maneuverability into play. But the Zero was too slow, too energy depleted from the prolonged vertical combat. Fraser rolled inverted, pulled through into a high-side gun pass, and for the first time in the engagement, lined up a perfect deflection shot. His finger tightened on the firing button. 8 303 Browning machine guns and 2 20mm Hispano cannons roared simultaneously. Tracers arced through the tropical sky, a brilliant deadly stream converging on the Zero. The burst lasted less than 2 seconds, but in aerial combat, 2 seconds is an eternity. Fraser's deflection calculation was perfect. Years of training and combat experience distilled into a single moment of geometric precision. The stream of 303 rounds and 20mm cannon shells converged exactly where the Zero would be, not where it was. Nakamura's aircraft shuddered violently as rounds tore through the lightweight aluminum skin. The lack of armor, which had made the Zero so nimble, now became its fatal weakness. Bullets that would have been stopped by the Spitfire's protective plating punched clean through the Zero's fuselage. A 20mm shell exploded in the engine cowling, shredding cooling lines and severing fuel feeds. Another burst walked along the wing route, compromising the structural integrity of the main spar. Black smoke erupted from the engine. Oil sprayed across Nakamura's windscreen, obscuring his vision. The Zero, moments ago a graceful predator, became a wounded animal. The engine coughed, seized and died. Silence replaced the familiar roar of the Sakai radial, a silence more terrifying than any sound of battle. Nakamura's training took over. Without engine power, he had perhaps 3 minutes of controlled flight before the Zero became an uncontrollable glider. He nosed down, trying to stretch his glide toward the nearest island, calculating distances and wind drift with the desperate precision of a pilot who knows death is a very real possibility. Fraser circled above, watching the smoking Zero descend. He didn't fire again. The engagement was over. The myth of invincibility had been shattered not through superior technology alone, but through the application of tactics that exploited the Zero's fundamental design compromises. The Japanese had built an aircraft optimized for a specific type of combat, low speed, turning dogfights where agility mattered more than speed or durability. Fraser had simply refused to fight that battle. The Zero disappeared into the cloud layer below, trailing smoke. Fraser didn't follow. Confirming kills over water was pointless and dangerous. Fuel was precious, and there were no witnesses in the empty Pacific sky. He noted the position, marked the time, and turned for home. What Fraser didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Nakamura would survive. The Japanese pilot managed to stretch his glide to a small atoll, ditching the Zero in shallow water near the beach. He would be rescued 3 days later by a Japanese submarine, dehydrated and injured but alive. And he would carry with him a revelation that would shake the confidence of every Zero pilot who heard his story. The invincible Zero could be beaten. Nakamura's debriefing was classified at the highest levels. Japanese Naval Aviation Command didn't want word spreading that their premier fighter aircraft had vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited. But among the pilot corps, stories circulated. A Zero, flown by an experienced ace, had been shot down by a European fighter that had no business competing in Pacific combat. The engagement had lasted nearly 20 minutes, an impossibly long time by Zero standards, where most dogfights were decided in seconds. The tactics Fraser employed, high speed, vertical maneuvering, refusing to engage in turning combat, became known among Allied intelligence as boom and zoom. It would become the standard doctrine for fighting the Zero. American pilots, initially trained to dogfight, were retrained to exploit energy advantages. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4U Corsair, both faster and more heavily armed than the Spitfire, would use these same principles to devastating effect. But on that morning in 1942, Fraser was simply glad to be alive. He landed his Spitfire at the primitive airstrip, carved from jungle, the engine still running smoothly despite the tropical heat and coral dust that had destroyed so many Merlin engines in the early Pacific deployments. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming. The squadron commander, Wing Commander Peters, approached as Fraser climbed stiffly from the cockpit. "Well, how does a Spitfire fare against a Zero?" Fraser pulled off his leather flying helmet, sweat-soaked hair plastered to his forehead. "Better than expected, sir. Much better. The Zero is brilliant at what it was designed to do, turn fighting at moderate speeds, but it's vulnerable everywhere else. If we fight our fight, not theirs, we can win." Peters nodded slowly. "You'll write a detailed combat report. Tactics, performance envelope, vulnerabilities. This needs to reach every Allied pilot in the theater." Fraser did write that report. It became required reading for fighter pilots throughout the Pacific. The techniques he pioneered, using altitude advantage, refusing turning engagements, exploiting the Spitfire's superior high-speed handling and structural strength, saved countless Allied lives in the years that followed. The engagement also marked a turning point in the psychological warfare of Pacific aviation. The Zero was no longer invincible. It could bleed, it could be beaten. And once that knowledge spread, the balance of air power began to shift inexorably toward the Allies. Fraser's combat report reached Allied headquarters within 48 hours. Copies were distributed to every fighter squadron in the Pacific Theater, from Australia to China, from the Philippines to the Aleutians. The document was clinical, precise, and devastating in its implications. The Zero, which had terrorized Allied pilots for nearly 2 years, was not invincible. It was simply optimized for a specific type of combat, and if you refused to fight that battle, you could win. The report outlined specific tactical principles that would become gospel for Allied fighter pilots. Never attempt to turn with a Zero below 300 knots. The Zero's light wing loading and large control surfaces made it unbeatable in slow-speed maneuvering. Attempting to dogfight on the Zero's terms was suicide. Always maintain an energy advantage. Use altitude and speed as a bank account. Spend it wisely in attack passes, then immediately cash out by climbing back to altitude. Never linger in the Zero's performance envelope. Exploit the Zero's structural weaknesses. In high-speed dives, the Zero's controls became dangerously heavy and its airframe subjected to stresses it wasn't designed to handle. The Spitfire and later the Hellcat and Corsair could dive faster, pull out harder, and sustain G-forces that would tear a Zero's wings off. Use vertical maneuvers exclusively. The vertical plane, climbing and diving, was where Allied fighters had advantages. The horizontal plane, turning, belonged to the Zero. Fight in 3 dimensions, not 2. Target the Zero's lack of protection. Without armor or self-sealing tanks, even brief bursts of gunfire could be catastrophic. Our Zero that would have absorbed punishment and continued fighting would instead explode or burn. Within weeks, American squadrons were drilling these tactics relentlessly. The Thatch Weave, developed independently by U.S. Navy Commander John Thatch, complemented Fraser's principles perfectly. 2 plane sections would scissor back and forth, protecting each other while preventing Zeros from exploiting their turning advantage. Combined with boom and zoom tactics, it proved devastatingly effective. The psychological impact was equally significant. Allied pilots, who had approached Zero encounters with understandable dread, now had a roadmap to victory. Confidence replaced fear. Aggressiveness replaced caution. The death spiral of morale, where losses bred more losses, reversed itself. Japanese pilots began noticing the change by late 1942. Allied fighters no longer tried to turn with them. Instead, they encountered high-speed slashing attacks from altitude, vertical maneuvers that exploited every weakness in the Zero's design, and a willingness to break off and reset rather than commit to drawn-out dogfights. The kill ratios, which had heavily favored Japan, began to equalize. Nakamura recovered from his ordeal and returned to combat duty, found himself flying increasingly defensive missions. The expansionist phase of Japanese Pacific operations had ended. Now they were defending conquered territory against an enemy that was learning, adapting, and building aircraft specifically designed to counter the Zero. He encountered American Hellcats in 1943 and was shocked by their performance, faster than the Spitfire, more heavily armed, and flown by pilots who clearly understood exactly how to fight. He survived the war, barely, and in post-war interviews spoke candidly about the engagement with the Spitfire. That British pilot showed me that we had built an aircraft for the war we wanted to fight, not the war we would eventually face, he reflected in 1952. The Zero was a masterpiece for 1940, but by 1942, the enemy had learned our secrets and built machines to exploit our weaknesses. We couldn't adapt fast enough. Fraser continued flying throughout the Pacific campaign, eventually transitioning to Spitfire reconnaissance variants as the fighter role shifted to newer aircraft better suited to tropical operations. He survived the war with 17 confirmed victories, 11 over Europe, 6 in the Pacific, and a Distinguished Flying Cross. His combat report became a foundational document in fighter tactics, studied at military academies decades after the war ended. The Spitfire's deployment to the Pacific remained limited. The harsh tropical environment and vast distances favored American designs specifically built for those conditions. But the handful of Spitfires that did serve there proved a critical point. With proper tactics, even aircraft not optimized for Pacific combat could defeat the Zero. Modern analysis of the engagement reveals just how perfectly Fraser executed his attack. Gun camera footage, recovered years later from Allied archives, shows the precision of his boom and zoom passes, the disciplined energy management, and the patient setup that gave him the perfect deflection shot. Military historians consider it a textbook example of exploiting technical intelligence to overcome a numerically and tactically superior opponent. The Zero itself continued to evolve. Later variants added armor, improved engines, and heavier armament. But the fundamental design compromises, lightweight and extreme range at the expense of protection and high-speed performance, could never be fully overcome. By 1944, the Zero was hopelessly outclassed by American fighters that were faster, tougher, and flown by pilots trained specifically to exploit every weakness. The legacy of that morning in 1942, when a lone Spitfire faced a legendary Zero and emerged victorious, extended far beyond the immediate tactical lessons. It demonstrated that technological superiority could be overcome through superior doctrine, that myths of invincibility were just myths, and that careful analysis of enemy capabilities could turn the tide of aerial combat. Today, at the RAF Museum in Hendon, a restored Spitfire MKVC sits in the Pacific Theater exhibit. The placard mentions Fraser's engagement with the Zero, noting it as the battle that changed fighter doctrine in the Pacific. Nearby, a captured Zero hangs from the ceiling, its lightweight construction visible in the thin aluminum skin and minimal internal structure. 2 aircraft, each a masterpiece of engineering for different philosophies of war. One proved that invincibility is an illusion, that every design involves compromises, and that the greatest weapon in any pilot's arsenal is not the aircraft they fly, but the knowledge of how to fly it against an enemy who expects them to fight a different battle entirely. The impact of Fraser's combat report spread through Allied air forces like wildfire through dry timber. Within weeks, every fighter squadron from Darwin to Ceylon was conducting intensive training in boom and zoom tactics. Pilots who had been flying defensive, survival-focused missions suddenly found themselves armed with a blueprint for victory. The psychological transformation was as significant as the tactical one. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, U.S. Marine Corps pilots gathered in sweltering ready rooms to study Fraser's engagement breakdown. Captain Joe Foss, who would become one of America's top aces, later recalled, "We'd been taught to dogfight, to mix it up close. That's how you won in training." But Fraser showed us that the real war wasn't about what looked impressive. It was about exploiting every advantage you had, while denying the enemy theirs. The Americans had a distinct advantage in implementing Fraser's doctrine. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, while inferior to the Zero in almost every performance metric, was rugged and heavily armed. Using vertical tactics, diving attacks followed by zooming climbs, Wildcat pilots began scoring victories against aircraft that should have dominated them. The kill ratio, which had been catastrophically lopsided in Japan's favor during the first 6 months of the Pacific War, began to equalize. But the true game-changer arrived in late 1943, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. This aircraft was, in many ways, the perfect answer to the Zero. It incorporated every lesson learned from Fraser's engagement and dozens of subsequent analyses. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, could dive faster, could absorb tremendous battle damage, and, critically, was designed from the ground up to fight using boom and zoom tactics. Hellcat pilots were drilled relentlessly in the Fraser doctrine: maintain altitude, use speed, never turn below 300 knots, exploit the vertical plane. The results were devastating. By 1944, the kill ratio had swung dramatically in favor of the Americans. In some engagements, it reached 19-1. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was being systematically hunted to extinction. Japanese commanders recognized the threat, but struggled to respond effectively. The Zero's fundamental design, lightweight construction, extreme range, superior maneuverability at low speeds, was deeply embedded in Japanese naval aviation doctrine. Redesigning from scratch would take years they didn't have. Instead, they attempted incremental improvements, adding armor, which reduced performance, installing more powerful engines, which were unreliable, and training pilots in new tactics, but with fuel shortages limiting training hours. New pilots arrived at frontline units woefully unprepared. Nakamura, now a training instructor himself after his rescue, found himself in the frustrating position of teaching tactics he knew were obsolete. He would brief new pilots on the Zero's capabilities, watch them light up with excitement about its legendary agility, and then have to explain the brutal reality. The Americans will not turn with you. They will attack from altitude in high-speed passes, and they will disengage before you can respond. Your maneuverability advantage is meaningless if they refuse to engage on those terms. The younger pilots, indoctrinated with stories of early Zero victories, struggled to accept this. Many died in their first combat missions, trying to force turning engagements against opponents who had been specifically trained to refuse them. By mid-1944, Allied pilots had so thoroughly internalized the anti-Zero doctrine that it became second nature. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, flying a Hellcat during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, shot down 6 Zeros in 8 minutes using textbook boom and zoom tactics. His gun camera footage, studied extensively in post-war analysis, shows perfect execution of Fraser's principles: high side passes, brief firing bursts, immediate disengagement and climb to reset. The irony was not lost on historians. The Zero, designed to achieve air superiority through superior maneuverability, had been defeated not by a more maneuverable opponent, but by opponents who simply refused to fight that type of battle. It was tactical judo, using the enemy's strength against them by denying them the opportunity to employ it. Fraser himself, now flying photo reconnaissance Spitfires over Burma and Malaya, heard reports of how his combat report had transformed Pacific air warfare. In a letter to his wife dated August 1944, he wrote, "It's strange to think that a 20-minute engagement over some forgotten patch of ocean might have influenced the course of thousands of subsequent battles. I suppose that's the nature of war. Small moments ripple outward in ways we can't predict." The final nail in the Zero's coffin came with the introduction of the Vought F4U Corsair in large numbers. Even faster than the Hellcat, with exceptional high-altitude performance and devastating firepower, the Corsair pilots, many trained by veterans who had studied Fraser's report, turned the Pacific skies into a shooting gallery. Japanese pilots, facing enemies who were better trained, better equipped, and tactically superior, could do little but die with honor. By 1945, the Zero was a relic. New Japanese aircraft, the J-2M Raiden, the N-1K2J Shidenkai, attempted to match Allied performance, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The war had moved beyond them. The war ended in August 1945, and with it, the era of the Zero. Of the approximately 11,000 Zeros produced during the war, fewer than a dozen survived intact. Most had been shot down, destroyed on the ground, or deliberately scrapped by occupation forces. The aircraft that had once symbolized Japanese air supremacy became a museum curiosity, a reminder of how quickly technological and tactical advantages could evaporate. Colin Fraser returned to Britain in late 1945, his war record impressive, but his demeanor unchanged. Modest, analytical, uncomfortable with acclaim. He was debriefed extensively by RAF intelligence officers eager to capture every detail of Pacific air combat for the permanent record. During these sessions, Fraser emphasized repeatedly that his victory over the Zero had not been about superior skill or courage, but about understanding and exploiting systemic weaknesses. The Zero was a magnificent achievement of engineering, he told one interviewer in 1946, but it was optimized for a war that lasted 6 months. After that, we learned its secrets, and every advantage it possessed became a liability. That's the nature of warfare. Adaptation beats innovation every time. Fraser's combat report, initially classified as secret, was declassified in 1952 and became required reading at military academies across the Western world. The U.S. Air Force Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base used it as a foundational text in their fighter tactics curriculum. Soviet military analysts, obtaining copies through intelligence channels, studied it intensively when developing doctrine for their MiG fighters during the Cold War. The principles Fraser outlined, energy management, vertical maneuvering, exploiting structural and performance envelope weaknesses, became the bedrock of modern air combat tactics. Every fighter pilot trained in the decades since has learned variations of the boom and zoom doctrine, even if they don't know its origin story. Hiroshi Nakamura's post-war life took a different trajectory. Stripped of his military rank during occupation, forbidden from flying by Allied authorities, he worked as a commercial fisherman and later as a translator. When Japan was permitted to establish a self-defense force in the 1950s, he was recruited as a civilian instructor, teaching the next generation of Japanese pilots. His lessons emphasized adaptability, the dangers of overconfidence, and the importance of understanding your opponent's capabilities as well as your own. In a 1965 interview with a Japanese aviation magazine, Nakamura reflected on his encounter with the Spitfire. "I entered that engagement certain of victory. I had superior maneuverability, extensive combat experience, and confidence built on dozens of successful missions. But the British pilot had something more valuable: knowledge. He knew my aircraft better than I knew his. He understood exactly which battle to fight and which to avoid. That is the lesson I carry. Technical superiority means nothing if your opponent dictates the terms of engagement." The two pilots never met, though they exchanged letters through military historical societies in the 1970s. Fraser wrote to Nakamura in 1973, expressing respect for his skill and acknowledging the Zero's remarkable qualities. Nakamura responded with gratitude, noting that their encounter had taught him humility and the value of continuous tactical evolution. It was a small gesture of reconciliation between warriors who had once tried to kill each other. Modern analysis of the engagement, enabled by computer simulations and detailed performance data unavailable during the war, confirms that Fraser's tactics were not merely effective, but optimal. Studies conducted at the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School in the 1990s, using accurate performance models of both aircraft, demonstrated that a Spitfire using boom and zoom tactics had approximately a 70% probability of victory against a Zero in a one-on-one engagement. A Spitfire attempting to turn fight had less than a 20% chance. The engagement also influenced aircraft design philosophy in subtle but profound ways. Post-war fighters, the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15 and their successors, were designed with high-speed performance and energy retention as primary considerations. Maneuverability remained important, but not at the expense of structural strength, speed, or climb rate. The Zero's design philosophy, extreme agility achieved through minimal weight, was relegated to history. Fraser died in 1989 at the age of 69. His obituary in the Times mentioned his Battle of Britain service and his Distinguished Flying Cross, but gave only passing reference to his Pacific combat. Most readers never knew that the modest retired wing commander had fundamentally altered the course of aerial warfare. Nakamura lived until 2001, reaching the age of 82. At his funeral, former students, pilots who had served in Japan's self-defense force, spoke of his emphasis on knowledge over bravado, on tactical flexibility over rigid doctrine. Several mentioned that he kept a model of a Supermarine Spitfire on his desk, a reminder of the day he learned that invincibility was an illusion. Today, aviation museums across the world display Spitfires and Zeros, often positioned near each other. Visitors admire their elegant lines, their engineering brilliance, their historical significance. Few understand that these aircraft represent not just technological achievements, but competing philosophies of warfare. One optimized for a specific type of combat, the other adaptable to multiple scenarios. The lesson of that morning in 1942, when Fraser faced Nakamura above the Solomon Islands, remains relevant in every domain of modern warfare. Understand your enemy, exploit their weaknesses, refuse to fight their battle, and never assume that reputation equals reality. The invincible can always be defeated, you just need to know where to aim.